Well, I don't know. Good afternoon. I am Wendy Edelberg, Director of the Hamilton Project. Thank you for joining us today. The 2021 expansion of the child tax credit showed how a relatively straightforward policy can do enormous amount of good. Long before the pandemic hit, strong research pointed to the benefits of financial support for families with children, not only by improving outcomes for the children, but also by sowing economic gains as those children grew into adulthood. In 2021, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which increased the CTC amount and, more importantly, made it available to the poorest children. It was the first time that the U.S. had near universal child allowances. Unfortunately, those changes only lasted 1 year. But that limited time frame allows us to examine the impacts of an expanded CTC. Today, we are so fortunate to be partnering with the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science to bring together experts to highlight rigorous research on that policy. While we're looking back, we hope that this research will spur future action. The 2021 expansion proved that we have the tools to alleviate child poverty. What we lack is political will. Our hope is that someday this research that we're talking about today can inform a more permanent expansion, that someday there will be a bipartisan agreement that we should care for our children and support families. And there's reason for optimism. At the state level, there are 10 states instituting fully refundable, albeit less generous, state CTCs. Throughout today's event, you can submit questions for speakers by emailing us at info@hamiltonproject.org. But first, we welcome a research presentation by Hilary Hoynes, who co-edited the Annals volume, along with Megan Curran and Zach Parolin. Hilary, thanks for joining us, and I'd like to welcome you up to the podium.
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome to everybody joining us today. I'm Hilary Hoynes, and I'm here to provide a bit of an overview of our new publication called Lessons from the 2021 Child Tax Credit Expansion. So the child tax credit is not new. It's been around since 1997, when it started out as a relatively modest $400 per child non-refundable tax credit. And it's been expanded many times since 1997, most recently and importantly in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts with Jobs Act, increased from $1,000 per child to $2,000 per child. Today we're here to talk about the 2021 expansion of the child tax credit, and that expansion contained three really central features. The first feature, as Wendy noted, was making the credit available to the poorest children, what is called in tax parlance full refundability, or not conditioning it on having earned income. In addition, the child tax credit was expanded from $2,000 per child up to $3,600 per child per year if your child was under 6, or $3,000 per child if your child was 6 or more. In addition, a third innovation of the 2021 child tax credit expansion was remitting the payment on a monthly basis between July and December 2021, as this was a period where there was a lot of need, and so having those benefits appear prior to tax time in the spring of 2022 could yield a lot of important findings. So the volume that my colleagues Megan, Zach, and I put together features 14 different pieces based on 30 experts talking about different elements of the child tax credit expansion. And given the importance and salience of this change in policy, there was an explosion of work going on in real time in evaluating what the effects of the child tax credit were. And so our central sort of guiding thought in putting together this issue was we wanted to find out what this expansion achieved, what were its limitations, how could we do better, and what should policymakers take into account when considering future program changes, and that's where we are today. We had articles from a wide range of scholars, and we are very lucky after my presentation to have 4 of those talented researchers who will be talking in conversation in a panel immediately following my remarks. What I want to do in the few minutes that I have up here is to give you a sort of top-line assessment of what our issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science found. And before I do that, I want to point out that this is available open access, so open your browser and search for it right now and take a look at the incredible range of pieces that we have and important findings for understanding the moment that we're in right now. So the first important top-line result from our findings is that the expansion of the tax credit in 2021 led to significant and important reductions in material hardship. So child poverty fell to its lowest value in recorded history in the United States for child poverty from 9.7% in 2020 to 5.2% in 2021. And it's estimated that 2 million children were lifted out of poverty purely because of that policy expansion. There was, of course, other things going on at that time as well. There's also significant evidence about improvement in food hardship and changes in spending on food and items that are targeted at children. So that's the first and probably most important top-line finding. We have another contribution to the special issue, which leverages the expansive amount of work that we have out there that's trying to study the long-term effects of providing more assistance to children and families when children are young, and asking the question, how does it change their life trajectory? And from that evidence, we know that providing more resources today, such as through the child tax credit, will increase future earnings of those children, improve their health, improve their human capital, lead to reduction in public health costs, reductions in connections with the criminal justice system, reduction in spending on child protective services. So a wide range of benefits both to families and to society at large in the long term. And the estimates for one of the chapters in our special issue concluded that if the 2021 child tax credit was permanent, these benefits that would accrue in the short, medium, and long term would amount to about $10 for every dollar cost of the credit. So that is where we get the sort of finding that the child tax credit is an investment in children. It's also very important to study other aspects of what's happening in real time of the child tax credit. So simple labor supply theory argues that the expansion of the credit would lead to a reduction in employment. And as will be discussed by one of our authors, Michael Strain, in the next panel, the chapter concludes that the available evidence shows that the effects on employment is small or absent. And so while generating these returns in the long run, it seems like a small trade-off against what at most might be small reductions in employment. Finally, we will also have a representative, Elaine Maag, author, in the panel to talk about what we've learned about alternative child tax credit expansions, the cost, the distributional implications. And a few of those top-line findings is that the expansion of the credit to the poorest children, the so-called full refundability, is relatively less expensive and where most of the anti-poverty effectiveness occurs. An expansion across the board in the credit is more expensive and has more even distributional impacts across the distribution. So, in conclusion, before turning it over the panel, our issue has consistent evidence that the 2021 child tax credit expansion benefited families and children across a wide range of indicators of well-being. And in this moment, more generally, this work shows the clear value of supporting families with children. And as was already mentioned by Wendy, this is something that is not limited to federal policy, but is federal policy has led and states are following with implementing their child tax credits. So the next panel is going to take it from here and continue the discussion as to alternative policy recommendations and trade-offs around the child tax credit, and to get into more of the evidence that was brought forth in the special issue. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Closer. Great. So thank you, Hilary, for the fantastic discussion of the research evidence. And I think that in a city that can be divided on a lot of different topics, I think there can be broad agreement that children are our most precious resource. And with that in mind, we're here to learn something about the child tax credits expansion in 2021, and we've got a fantastic set of 3 experts to get into it about. So I want to provide just some very brief introductions, okay? So we have Elaine Maag, Senior Fellow and Co-Director at the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, and so she's leading the program focused on innovations in cash assistance for children. So she's an expert in tax policy and recently wrapped up a stint as an advisor in the U.S. Treasury Department. So she's been thinking really hard about these issues related to the delivery and the distributional impacts of refundable tax credits. So again, these introductions are way too short. Robert Greenstein, he's a visiting fellow in the Hamilton Project here at Brookings. Prior to Brookings, Bob founded and served as President Emeritus at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He's President Emeritus now. So Bob's been a go-to for years on issues related to budget, fiscal, and social policy issues. Last, certainly not least, Michael Strain is Director of Economic Policy Studies. He's also the Arthur Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. Mike is also a professor of practice at Georgetown in the McCourt School of Public Policy. He has studied the impacts of refundable credits on work participation. He's also written extensively about domestic economic policies, how they impact America's families. My name is Bradley Hardy. I'm a professor of public policy in the McCourt School. I'm also a contributor to the volume. I've conducted a lot of work on economic insecurity, and I've thought alongside my co-author, Charles Ockham, about the distributional impacts of the child tax credit by race. So, yeah. And my mic might be on. Here we go. We're back on. Okay. So I want to kick off with Elaine, okay? So, and do we, yep, we're in and out here. We got it. Okay. So, Elaine, the CTC underwent substantial changes in 2021. Hilary outlined those pretty extensively just now, right? Can you highlight some of the most important policy changes just in your view, and just tell us a bit more about why we may or may not want to bring back some of those changes? Were they uniformly positive, some better than others? Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
So first, thanks so much for allowing me to be here today. I swear I almost wore a blue shirt. But next
didn't plan
time.
that.
So I also want to thank Sophie Collier, who's in the audience, who worked on the paper with me, and my other co-author, Nikki Airy. So I think when we talk about any policy, we ought to be thinking about who gets the policy. Is it going to the right people? And how are we delivering the policy? And as Hilary noted, the CTC expansion in 2021 allowed us a really exciting opportunity to look at these two questions pretty deeply. So I want to highlight that the child tax credit was bigger for young children than older children in 2021. This is based on years of research that shows the early years of a child's development are particularly critical in launching how they're going to, make their way through the world.
Sure.
And so this was an evidence-based experiment, and I would say that was a net positive. The other thing that it delivered, the credit for the first time went to the very lowest income families. So every year, about 17 million children don't receive the full value of the child tax credit, and that's because of the way it's designed. It phases in with earnings, and their parents simply don't earn enough, though almost all of those parents are working. And so to deliver the credit to even very low-income children was very novel, and we saw that they used the credit in a little bit different ways. So the Pulse survey data showed us the credit was being used to purchase food. For higher income families, it was being used to offset debt more often. And so there's different ways families were using the credit. And then the final thing I want to talk about is the how did we deliver it? So for the first time, we had a robust example of delivering a tax credit on a monthly basis. The reason we could do this was in large part because we didn't have a lower credit for very low income families. Usually in the tax system, if you get a credit advanced and you end up owing taxes, you have to pay that at tax time. So there was very little chance this was going to happen because even if your income dropped, you weren't going to reduce your credit. And we also had a hold harmless provision. So if a payment was sent to you errantly, in the end, most low-income families got to keep those. And so we got to see this monthly delivery that allowed us to do two things. The first is it offsets the volatility that very low-income families face. Their incomes are bouncing around and around. And it also allowed them to spend money when a need arose rather than waiting or buying on credit, as is typical.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just two quick points, and maybe we can get into this later. This notion that you have a larger credit for the families with the youngest kids, and that's a time when these parents are going to be, due to childcare needs, maybe less likely to be able to work as much, right? And so they might be at their lowest point in terms of incomes, and that might be more useful. Another interesting point, hopefully we'll have time to get into it, there's all these different ways in which the credit can positively impact families that might not even be necessarily poor by strict definition. They might be at risk of using alternative financial instruments, payday loans, things like that. And I know you've conducted some of that work with folks at WashU. Yeah. So,
yeah, that's a great point. Thanks.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll have time for that. A lot to get into here. Bob Greenstein. So, we've heard a lot now from both Hilary and Elaine with respect to, what we've learned from the 2021 experience. And so, when I think about budget and tax issues, you're one of the first folks who I want to hear from, among many, right? Now that we have a very large tax reform that's approaching here in D.C., what changes to the child tax credit would you recommend that policymakers make or not make, given what we have in front of us?
Well, thanks, Bradley. Given the data and research showing both short-term and long-term benefits from providing income support to low-income children, as Hilary talked about, my top priority for the child credit in this year's tax bill would be to make it fully refundable, fully available to the poorest children, if that were a possibility. But it is not a possibility. It is not politically feasible. It won't be on the table. This will be a Republican tax bill. That does not mean, however, that no improvements can be made for low-income children. To the contrary, there's a potential to secure important improvements for millions of kids in low-income working families. I'd note that a bipartisan tax package negotiated in part last year by the Republican chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, contains significant child credit improvements for such children and got over 350 votes on the House floor, including the votes of 169 House Republicans. So, within the bounds of what might have a chance of being politically feasible this year, my top priority would be for a package of changes for children in families with lower modest earnings, with the following elements. One, phase in the credit with earnings on a per-child basis. Now, currently, the credits are provided on a per-child basis to middle income and affluent families, but it's essentially provided on a per-family basis to kids in low-income families because of the way that the credit phases in. Secondly, phase out or eliminate what we call the refundability cap that further limits how much children in low-income working families can receive from the credit. Both of those two provisions were part of last year's bipartisan tax bill. And the third element in this low-income package I'm recommending is to start phasing in the credit with the first dollar of parents' earnings, as we do with the earned income credit, rather than waiting until after the family gets to $2,500 in earnings. Now, one positive for this three-part package is it's pretty inexpensive. Relative to a baseline under which the full credit remains at $2,000 per child, the cost, and I'm drawing on Elaine's piece in the ANNALS volume here, the cost should be roughly in the vicinity of only $75 billion over 10 years. Compare that to the multi-trillion-dollar cost of extending the full 2017 tax cut, or the big costs of various other tax cuts being talked about, or the $1 trillion plus cost over 10 years of reinstating the full 2021 child tax credit expansion. Importantly, the cost is also quite low compared to the cost of raising the credit amount above $2,000 per child. Consider an option to raise the full amount per kid from $2,000 per child to $3,000, as analyzed by Elaine in her article. That would cost roughly in the vicinity of maybe $450 billion. We're approaching $500 billion over 10 years. And I think this is crucial, Elaine's paper finds that if you raise the credit from $2,000 to $3,000 per kid without making other changes in the credit, particularly for low-income families, that if you raised it from $2,000 to $3,000, 83% of the benefit goes to the top 3 quintiles, and the top quintile, the richest 20% of the income distribution, would get more than the bottom 2 quintiles combined. I also want to note one other child credit proposal that might be able to, already has, attracted some Republican support, and that's the idea of creating a new component of the credit for newborns, because it would be limited to newborn kids as opposed to kids up to age 17. Its costs should be quite manageable, especially if it's something like $1,000 or $1,500 per newborn. And a newborn credit, I would think, probably would be fully refundable. I mean, I don't know of any social program that imposes work requirements on mothers who have just given birth to an infant. So I'd suggest the top priorities within the bounds of what hopefully would be politically feasible would be the 3-part low-income package I've described, the newborn credit that's fully refundable, and indexing the $2,000 amount per child so it doesn't erode. However, my final point, I want to emphasize this, raising the credit amount above $2,000 as indexed should be approached with great caution, especially if, as looks likely, it would have to be paid for with spending cuts. Raising the credit above $2,000 per child and paying for that with cuts in Medicaid and SNAP would make low-income children and families worse off, not better off, and it would redistribute income from low-income families to families higher on the income scale. not every expansion of the child credit is necessarily a positive for children living in poverty.
So this is really helpful because ultimately we're trying to think hard about trade-offs. I think folks in this room and online are very attuned to this, and with a unified goal of trying to improve child outcomes, right? And so even from initially starting off with Hilary's discussion, that we know now that there are some really impressive long-run intergenerational benefits, broadly speaking, from the receipt of government supports early on in childhood, it doesn't mean that there aren't potential costs. So there's a benefit side that I think we're learning more about in contemporary social sciences research, but there are costs. There's the actual dollar outlay, and then there's potential behavioral costs. There's potential behavioral responses to work. And so this is a nice kind of lead in to thinking about Mike Strain's work. Mike, you've co-authored more recently with Diane Schanzenbach, both on earned income tax credit work impacts, but also here, the 2021 expanded child tax credits impact on work. And so, you know, I'm wondering if you can just talk about your motivation for this framework, why it matters. I mean, I think outside of economics and policy circles, folks might even wonder why that is the relevant question or a relevant question. So kind of talking about that and then maybe sharing a bit more about what you concluded.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think the question that you ask is ultimately a question of values, I think. You know, empirical social science can identify trade-offs, can quantify the magnitude of effects on various outcomes. You know, one outcome might be a reduction in poverty, another outcome might be a reduction in employment, another outcome might be, you know, the long-term earnings of kids. But, you know, trying to figure out what's important, you know, which trade-offs are worth it in a normative sense is a question of values. I think a lot of people, both, you know, voters, members of Congress, participants in the policy debate, a lot of people care a lot about employment. And that's because employment is considered a crucial component of a full life for many people, because employment is a source of dignity for many people, and because employment is the principal path to self-sufficiency for most people. And so it's an outcome that people are quite interested in, and one that I personally think is quite important.
Sure. Okay. No, that's helpful. And then, you know, when you all were thinking about the impacts in 2021, and I think Hilary spoke to this briefly, but was your general take that these employment effects, they weren't quite zero, but were they qualitatively small? I mean,
well, so you mentioned a couple of papers I have with Diane Schanzenbach, right. One on the earned income credit and one on the child credit, and right. I think a kind of common theme from both of those is the importance of being very careful about your research design. Yeah. And what we found was that when you look at the sample of people who are most likely to be directly affected by the policy. In the case of the child credit, unmarried moms with relatively low levels of education who have relatively younger kids. You know, that's where it looks like there might be an employment effect. When you broaden to look at broader groups, at groups with more education, then the evidence of an effect is much weaker, and that's similar to the same lesson that we drew from our work on the earned income credit as well.
No, that's helpful. I mean, you know, some work that I'm actually engaged in with a team of researchers at Urban is really very much thinking about what are folks doing with their time. And I think that that's going to be an interesting question to consider, that there's work and then there's non-work, and then there's a lot of stuff that we're doing out of work that's really important, and it might even support us being able to work in the first place. And so I think it really does lead to a whole bunch of really important discussions in terms of how families actually function. So I really appreciate your comments here. Now, we do have some questions from the audience that were previously submitted, and some folks might be adding in questions here as well. But I did want to just kick off by just asking, to the degree you can, one or maybe perhaps the most important learning or takeaway that you saw from the expanded CTC. It might not even be something that you directly worked on, but just what you observed. If you had one thing, how might you think that sort of one fact in terms of what you saw in 2021, how might that operate to improve the child tax credit today? Now, Bob, in some respects, I think you kind of answered the question, because I thought I heard you say, look, I'd love full refundability. And I am talking about the world in which there's not a direct political constraint.
So I'll look back on the Washington University study you mentioned.
Yep.
What we learned is what a lot of people suspected. People spend the money in a lot of different ways. I am originally from Kansas, and when I look at folks in Kansas, I think they need to buy a car. They need transportation. Here in DC, transportation is not my greatest issue. Childcare is my greatest issue. And so people's needs are very diverse, and we saw that in the data. So that's why we think a cash program like the child tax credit can be really extra beneficial, because we allow people to get the things and services that they think will be most valuable to them.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So I've been working in recent months on a paper not yet out that looks at changes in the U.S. safety net since 1970. And not surprisingly, there have been many expansions, and they've reduced overall poverty and child poverty.
Yep.
Changes in food stamps, SSI for disabled children, and the like. Is my mic not working? Changes like that.
Okay.
And you get an increment here and an increment there, and increments can be millions of kids.
Yep.
But in 2021, with one set of policy changes, a fully refundable child credit and an increased credit, we reduced child poverty by something like 1/3 with one policy measure, the child tax credit improvements. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the U.S. safety net, where one set of changes in one program had such a massive impact in reducing child poverty. To me, that's the single most important takeaway. And we have lots of research showing that growing up in poverty is not good for children's long-term development or society and the economy as a whole. So that's the overriding message for me.
Okay.
I think the biggest thing I've taken away is the importance of being clear about policy goals.
Okay.
And Bob touched on this in his introductory comments. What is the purpose of this policy? Is the purpose of this policy to lift kids out of poverty? Is the purpose of this policy to reduce the tax liability of households making six-figure incomes? Is the purpose of this policy to increase employment? Is the purpose of this policy to support childcare costs? I mean, all these arguments are made, and I think any assessment of what happened in 2021 that attempts to draw lessons for the future has to reckon with the fact that this was not a popular policy. It was not a policy that Congress chose to continue. My recollection is that it is not a policy that had the support of the majority of the American people, most of whom got some money out of this policy. My recollection, which should be double-checked, is that it did not have the support of most Democrats. Congress attempted to revisit this, coupling an expansion of the credit with some important tax incentives for businesses. That failed. And why is that? And I don't really know why it is. But the way that progressives talk about this policy is that it is this, kind of like piece of magic, that's able to solve all of our problems. And if it's able to solve all of our problems, why is it so unpopular? I could venture an answer that I'm not super confident in, but the answer I would venture is that the advocates for the policy are not specific about what the objective of the policy is. And that is not true of Bob, who's admirably clear on the importance of targeting safety net programs and targeting public programs in general, and and who always speaks about the child credit as a way to fight poverty. But that's not universally true. And so, if I'm a member of Congress and I'm listening to the debate about this policy, I think I don't really know what I'm supposed to be supporting and why. And that seems like a pretty fundamental challenge for the community of advocates around this.
Let me just ask Elaine or Bob if you have any immediate response to Mike's point.
Bob agrees.
I think
Simple.
Do I still need this? Yes. All right. I think this is often the case, and it adds problems, but I think there sometimes is a difference between what's the clear goal, or what's the most important goal, and for me it would be lowering poverty, helping poor kids, and exactly how you communicate that. Mm-hmm. And I do think, particularly in the world in which we're now in, that it's vitally important to communicate, among other things, the importance of child credit expansion to working poor families, low-income working families. There's obviously a lot more political sympathy for hard-pressed working families struggling paycheck to paycheck, as the phrase goes, than for families who, often for very good reasons, illness, incapacity, very young kids, whatever, are unable to work on a regular basis for a majority of their time. But I do think sometimes there's a distinction between the goal itself and exactly how you communicate that goal.
But as you pointed out, most of the money does not go to the working class and the poor. Most of the money goes to people who are higher income than that.
Well, this is another issue, but one thing that I think I find people often miss is that while the $2,000 per child credit under the 2017 tax law that will presumably be extended, under that, the $2,000 per kid does not begin to phase out until family income surpasses, for married couples, $400,000 a year. What I find people often have missed is that the expansion of the credit to $3,600 for young kids and $3,000 for older kids in the 2021 American Rescue Plan, that the increase above $2,000 began to phase out at somewhere around $150,000 a year, not $400,000 a year.
It was 160.
We could. I see no reason why the credit shouldn't begin to phase out until you get to $400,000 a year. But we have one party that doesn't want to raise taxes on anybody, and another party that doesn't want to raise taxes on anybody who makes under $400,000 a year. And that's a fundamental political obstacle to being able to do things like the child tax credit in the most effective and efficient ways.
I want to do a look back that reflects an audience question to talk about some politics, but I will just comment that it is interesting. We have a challenge in this country around the salience or lack of salience as it relates to the tax system more generally. It is complex. We're doing a lot of things in the tax system. And even when you try to make comparisons between refundable tax credits and, say, cash payments through some sort of cash assistance program or universal basic income, it's really hard to compare because delivering through the tax system brings its own potential barriers, right? But it does strike me that, when you think about what people do or don't like, there's probably an opportunity for thinking harder about narrative change, thinking about the notion that there's a way to describe to folks what it is they're getting, how they received it, who it's targeted towards. And so I think that that's probably a component of policy communication that none of us are actually well-versed in, knowing all of our respective expertise, right? And it is an interesting thing that when I think about America's families, I think a lot of the survey evidence says, folks do not aspire to be poor. They don't want to be linked with poverty. And so programs that are labeled as anti-poverty, oftentimes it's something that you might even want to distance yourself from. But we know people make these transitory moves into and out of poverty, right? It's not a static thing. Now, the question from the audience really was around the politics and the political dynamics that prevented this policy from becoming permanent. And again, I think it's easy to take for granted on this stage kind of why we are where we are and how we got here. But to the degree that you're respectively sort of comfortable kind of synthesizing, what occurred back in 2021 that led to not making permanent this benefit that appears to be so generous, so helpful for U.S. families. And Elaine, I'm happy to start with you.
So I think I would comment that I think it was a bit of a surprise. Every time we've expanded the child tax credit in the past, those expansions have stuck. We expect that the TCJA changes will stick. And so there was a moment when I think we were sort of like, let's build the evidence, let's dig into this, but we thought this is great policy and it will continue. So I think there's a little bit of being caught a little bit flat-footed that it became such a debate. But then also, I think, we're just at this political moment that's really difficult to grapple with, and we need to figure out what are the most compelling arguments. How can we convince people that their government can work for them in more than just times of great chaos? So people seem to accept when, the whole bottom of the economy falls out, we're going to help people. But there's no reason that government can't also provide assistance during normal times, recognizing that some people's lives are quite chaotic on the regular. So I think we need to sort of be much more clear about how a government can provide help and how the government can actually do it better than other sectors, because they're big. They have the IRS, which has all this data on income. Like, they have systems that are ready to work.
No, that's helpful.
I don't want Mike to have a heart attack there.
I would add some, I agree with all that, but I would add some other thoughts. This is part of a larger, very serious problem we face in our country of intense political polarization by party to a greater degree than I remember at any time since I came to Washington 52 years ago. The increase in the credit we're referring to, the 2021 increase, was passed as part of the American Rescue Plan. As I recall, it got either very few or zero Republican votes in either chamber. This was viewed as a Democratic bill that Republicans opposed and sought to get rid of at the first opportunity. So when there was an attempt in 2022 as part of what was initially called Build Back Better to make the full refundability component permanent, it was clear from the outset that it could only be done, it had to pass just with Democratic votes, and there was a pretty narrow margin to do that in the Senate. Priorities had to be set, and ultimately the House and the President, Biden, did set priorities, making the priority the poor and low-income kids by proposing in the final version of that bill to make the full refundability part of the child tax credit permanent and the increase in the amounts per kid extend just for a couple of years. And it certainly had the votes to pass the House. But As time went on, it became clear it did not have the votes to pass the Senate. We should remember how close it came. I'm not recalling whether it was just one vote in the Senate, Senator Manchin's, or two. But we came very, very close, one or two votes in the Senate, from achieving full refundability here. The larger question it raises going forward is there shouldn't need to be a trifecta, particularly a Democratic trifecta, controlling White House, House, and Senate all at the same time, in order to make improvements, particularly full refundability, for children through the child tax credit. It's part of the larger issue of how do we get back to being able to do policies like this in ways that are not solely limited to one party. I remember for years my closest ally on food stamps was Bob Dole, who was a key Republican in the Senate.
And from Kansas.
And from Kansas. But the way things are now, the degree of polarization we have makes matters like this a lot more difficult.
So I think it's an excellent question. I certainly don't want to disagree with Bob that we're very polarized. I would note that in 2017, some Republican senators quite credibly threatened to tank the entire tax reform bill over this issue, insisting that the child credit be increased. In 2017, the amount of refundability was increased, and that was that was a Republican bill, I would not say there's a bipartisan consensus around expanding the credit. I certainly don't think that there's a bipartisan consensus on full refundability. There's not. But there's some pretty prominent Republicans who have supported full refundability, including Vice President Vance, who kind of nodded to it during the campaign, during the Trump-Vance 2024 campaign. They didn't really dig into it, but they didn't really dig into many policy issues during the campaign. I think to answer your question, one area for I think further study is the monthly payment structure. Okay. Just anecdotally, I think a lot of middle class households didn't like that, and I wouldn't be surprised if some rigorous research could demonstrate that eroded support among people for it. Now, I know that for a lot of the advocates for this policy who are focused on low-income Americans, that's a really crucial component. So, maybe you make it low-income for households below an income you make it monthly for households below an income threshold or something like that. I think a second really important consideration, just in the kind of narrative history of what happened, Senator Manchin was very worried about the employment effects of the policy.
Yes.
And Senator Manchin from West Virginia, believed that his experience as a leader in that state taught him that if you give households checks with no work requirement or work obligation attached to it, that's bad for the people who are receiving the checks over the longer term. Now, experts may disagree with that assessment, but it's I think important for the advocacy community to kind of wrestle hard with the fact that they haven't convinced people like Senator Manchin of this. My own experience talking to people around town who were involved in this, suggests to me that there is a conflation of the cash welfare program that was ended in the 90s with a refundable child credit.
Okay.
The underlying economics of the AFDC program are completely different. than the underlying economics of a refundable CTC. But those differences, I don't think, have been adequately explained to the policy community, and that's an opportunity as well. And then finally, look, I think in reference to my earlier comments, there is a degree of enthusiasm for this policy that I think people who are not fully convinced of its merits find perplexing. This is an area where I think Bob and I might disagree. I am not particularly impressed by the child poverty reduction from the 2021 ARP CTC expansion. If your notion of poverty is such that, like, if you give somebody $10 and they're over the poverty threshold, they're no longer poor, I would argue that you're taking the poverty threshold too literally. Okay. And when I think about lifting people out of poverty, what I think of is people whose lives are materially better, whose outcomes are materially better in a durable way, and that betterment is connected to an increase in their own self-sufficiency. And taking a household that was $2,000 below the poverty threshold, giving them $4,000, and then declaring that they're no longer in poverty, to me is not a particularly compelling exercise or reason to support this policy. And I suspect that is the reaction of a lot of people who read breathless coverage in the New York Times about how there are no more poor people anymore because of this magic bullet we've discovered.
This is helpful, and I can tell Bob wants to jump in, and maybe Elaine as well. So I'm going to be very quick and say that, yes, for the listening audience, there was this kind of comparison, depending on how you felt about the 1996 welfare reform, then, you did at times have a sense that, hey, look, the 2021 expansion of the child tax credit is really kind of swooping in and correcting a mistake from the mid to late 90s. And on the other hand, I think, to be overly simplistic about it, you had characterizations that, hey, look, this is bad because we did it the right way in the mid 90s, and we made these big reforms to kind of curtail cash assistance as it was delivered. And there's a lot more nuance in there, but I do want to allow for space for folks to respond.
Well, I think Michael's point about the conflation with AFDC and the 96 welfare law is really critical. I would partially disagree, not entirely, with several other things Michael said. I agree that when somebody like myself says it reduced child poverty by a third, yes, on the one hand, that includes people who are only a little below the poverty line going above it. But where I would quarrel, Michael, with you on that is it also includes millions of kids who lived in deep poverty, still being poor, but much less poor. A family with 2 kids that was living at maybe 20%, 30% of the poverty line, getting another $6,000 or $7,000 that moved them much closer to the poverty line. That's a huge difference.
I agree.
So I think we need to look at the full nuances there. With respect to Manchin, my only addition to what you said, absolutely right that I don't want to for a moment question his sincerity. Mm-hmm. He believed it would have an effect on employment, a big one. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, he also thought that a lot of very poor families would just use the credit to buy drugs. And I think there's now research indicating that, in fact, they did not use the credit to just go out and buy drugs. The final point I'd make is you're a little more optimistic on the Republican side than I am.
I didn't mean to express optimism.
Well, your reference to 2017.
It's just happened.
So the lead senator who pushed for more, Republican senator, who pushed for more refundability in 2017 was Marco Rubio, who's now the Secretary of State. And indeed, he started off in a really good place on that. But at the end of the day, the Republican leaders pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. And in the end, what Rubio settled for, this is the increase in refundability Michael refers to, is that the credit now begins to phase in at $2,500 in earnings instead of at $3,000 of earnings, which gives a grand total of an additional $75 a year to millions of low-income families. Refundability improved, but only at the margin.
And I guess I would just add, we know research takes time. Poverty was something that was easy and quick to calculate, so of course we talked about it a lot. But we also now know, and there's papers in this volume that speak to this, that as Hilary mentioned, food insecurity dropped. Parents talked about putting their kids in after-school programs. Parents talked about buying childcare. Parents talked about spending more time with their kids, work that you're doing.
Yeah.
So this is, now we have a more concrete way to talk about it, and I think those things can be more persuasive than just a mathematical calculation. So I appreciate that point.
Elaine, I had a question for you as time kind of starts to land here. If you were to look at the entitlements, they're wildly popular. People don't want to touch them. So I'm talking about Social Security, Medicare, and a key feature is universality, right? And so you might not get as much further up the distribution, but by and large, everybody's participating. And so, I wonder, do you view it as a feature or a bug that you have this phase out of the child tax credit that we're talking about at several $100,000? So relatively affluent households, is that the political cost? Is that the thing that helps to make it more popular?
I mean, I think that certainly was the thinking when Clinton implemented it. It was a middle-class tax cut. It was supposed to go broadly,
Yep.
and that's how, it became a supported program. I do question...
And it was in the Contract for America.
Yes.
It was in Newt Gingrich's
wow.
Contract for America. Him and President Clinton worked on it together.
I haven't heard that in a while. Yep. America. Yeah.
And I do think, maybe that was true, but I take also to heart what Michael's pointing out, like in my own household, when the child tax credit started coming to our house, my husband walked down the stairs and was like, why are we getting this monthly payment? It is messing up our withholding. And I was like, that is my life's work.
Be happy about it.
Yeah. And so there was, and I had tons of friends coming to me like, why am I getting this? And I'm like, you've always been getting
always
it.
been getting it.
Like,
Okay.
people just don't understand. And so I guess as a silent benefit in the tax system, it's A-okay. People don't like to have their taxes raised, but it is hard to know, maybe there is a point when people think it's just too much.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, I wrote a paper on this you can find on the Hamilton Project website in 2022. The view, I think, that universal programs always do better than targeted programs is demonstrably incorrect.
Okay.
The universal programs are very expensive.
Yep.
And that really creates a limit on them. If you look, I just updated this for the paper I'm now working on. If you look at expenditures from 1970 to the present, you find that in percentage terms, expenditures on targeted or means-tested programs have grown by more in percentage terms than expenditures on universal programs. Not all universal programs do great. One of the programs that has shrunk the most over the last 50 or 60 years is unemployment insurance, and that is a universal program. I think the lesson is that programs that are very narrowly targeted just on the poor don't do particularly well politically. But if you target a program so it includes at least the lower middle class, hard-pressed working families, often up into the middle class itself, those programs can do quite well politically. And the risk is that if you put too many of your eggs in the universal basket, you may end up not having enough resources remaining for the families and the children that need it the most.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for sharing your insights. And as tax reform heats up here in the city, hopefully the CTC will be part of the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. It's fun.